Hello, everyone. So we left off with the Jefferson presidency, and so now we're going to pick up with the War of 1812 and other foreign affairs. Let's get to it. So, after Jefferson's second term, you have James Madison, the fourth president of the United States. He becomes president in 1808. Where we had left off, we talked about the Battle of Tippecanoe, and we talked about how there were certain members in Congress known as the War Hawks that were pressuring the president into war with the British. War Hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. There are several different reasons why we entered the war. Some of the grievances were impressment. That was removing sailors from American ships and forcing them to serve in the British Navy, also attacking those ships. You also had the apparent arming of Native Americans. Remember, we found that the Native Americans actually had British weapons. And then we also wanted to expand west. War actually begins in 1812, and we declare war on the British. In reality, it lasts 32 months, so it's not just in 1812. It's longer than our involvement in World War I or the Mexican-American War, which we'll talk about later on in this class. We have an attempt to invade Canada very early in the war. At this time, you had about 7.5 million people who lived in the United States compared to only about 500,000 that lived in Canada. And most of the ones in Canada who lived there were of French or American descent instead of British descent. So a lot of people, including major leaders within our country, like Thomas Jefferson, thought that this would be an easy invasion. The British, they were across the ocean. They had they already been distracted with Napoleonic Wars. However, we were doomed from the beginning. We did have a population advantage, but we had only about 12,000 men in uniform. Remember, during the Jefferson presidency, the number of people within the military was decreased. So, and a lot of historians have agreed that there were a lot of incompetent officers during this time and a lot of recruits that had not been trained very well, if at all. So the British, they also controlled the Great Lakes, and so they were better equipped to move their troops and their supplies. The British also, they had a lot more support from the Canadians. Americans, like we thought that they would welcome us as like basically liberators. But that wasn't really exactly what happened. And the Native American tribes also did mostly support the British because we were trying to expand west, remember. So we were woefully unprepared. At the beginning, the British actually found our plans. It was a difficult assault to wage. In about 1813, the Americans, we finally got it together with the help of a better navy. We had increased the army. There were new military commanders like William Henry Harrison, who will be a future president. And the troops were more experienced, they were better trained. We destroyed the British fleet on Lake Erie. This was a major accomplishment. And we took over other key strategic places. However, overall, if these attacks were better coordinated, we would have really stretched the British thin, and they may have ended up losing with this invasion of Canada. We ended up losing for many different reasons as far as the U.S. invasion of Canada. We're not talking about the war in general, but the Napoleonic Wars started to wind down. And so the British were sending a lot more troops over. So we finally withdrew our troops from Canada in 1814. And so ever since this point, the U.S. and the Canadian armies, they have not fought each other, and we have been strong allies together. But anyways, so our invasion of Canada ultimately fails. We did not have the best strategy there. Now, during that time, what is modern day Toronto, which was called York back then, we had burned it. And so, in order to pay us back for that, the British decided to burn Washington, D.C. And so, this response was quite unfortunate for the Americans. So, the British troops occupied the Capitol and they set fire to a lot of federal buildings, but the key one that we're going to talk about is the White House. Soldiers, whenever they came in, they reportedly they had sat down and they ate a meal, and this was leftover food from the White House. People had been eating on that, and then they decided to go ahead and take part. British troops had been gathering in the distance, and First Lady Dolly Madison decided to abandon where she was in the White House. And so instead of getting her personal belongings, she got what she could. And part of that was a full length portrait of George Washington. And you can see this pictured here. This is what she saves as a priceless White House artifact. And it was kept for safekeeping. So President Madison, obviously, and the First Lady and other high-level members in the government, they fled the city. And actually, the president and his wife were able to return 3 days later, and they stayed in what's known as the Octagon House. And it wasn't until 1817 that the next president was actually able to come in with James Monroe. So, and this is the only time in U.S. history where a foreign military has occupied Washington, D.C. Okay, so the Battle of New Orleans and Andrew Jackson. So this is where you see future President Andrew Jackson come to notoriety. Andrew Jackson was brilliant on the battlefield, and so he wins two decisive victories, one at Horseshoe Bend and the other one is New Orleans. So what was ridiculous was that the peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, had already been signed whenever these battles were fought, or excuse me, whenever New Orleans was fought. But this reaffirms that the United States will not be messed with. It reaffirms our independence, essentially. And Andrew Jackson is launched into being a household name. People know who he is now, and he will eventually be president mainly because of this. We see a swift end to the Federalist Party. There had not been a Federalist president since John Adams, and there wouldn't be any more. Spoiler alert. But Alexander Hamilton had already been killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. That knocked out one of the key Federalist leaders. Okay, so in 1814, the Federalists meet and they send delegates to discuss the major opposition to the War of 1812. So these delegates, they represented this dominant political party in New England. New England was mostly made up of Federalists at this point. So there were rumors that circulated that the convention was flirting with the idea of the secession of New England. And what that means is New England would leave the Union. However, most New England Federalists really held more moderate views and really were very fearful of this talk of secession and thought that it would lead to civil war. Because the next time that truly secession is brought up in a serious manner, it leads to the Civil War. They wanted to address some of the policies between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's presidencies. Jefferson had tried to use the embargo as a force to address the conflict with the British, but it was a policy that devastated the economy of New England because they were centered around manufacturing and trade, and it cut off trade. The New England states just did not support the war for the most part. They feared a land invasion, and they didn't want to place their militias under a federal control. So this results in a declaration calling on the federal government to protect New England and to help them with their badly affected trade economy. The most important thing to know about this is that their timing was really bad. So news reached the United States in January while the Hartford Convention was still in session that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. And so shortly after this, the Federalist Party just kind of dissolves because this was a disgrace to their party. It made them embarrassed. And then we start to see what's called the era of good feelings, and we will talk about this we'll talk about this in great detail later on. The Treaty of Ghent ends the war. No real territory changes here, but again, what's important is it does reaffirm that idea that the Americans are independent from the British, and it is not up for debate at this point. So, a couple of things. After James Madison, you have James Monroe is elected president. The northern border is established in 1817, and then you have the Adams-Onis Treaty. This formally brings Florida into the United States. So, the Monroe Doctrine is something you need to put a star, underline, highlight, whatever, in your notes. So this was essentially, obviously, James Monroe's foreign policy statement. And this is something that we will be mentioning throughout this class and even into American history too. So basically, this warned European powers not to attempt further colonization or any sort of interference in the Western Hemisphere. So none in North and South America. And so this would be the cornerstone of U.S. diplomacy for generations. The idea here is we want to establish the United States, and we don't want other foreign entities to intervene or interfere. We want to be able to establish our nation. And so at this point, you had Latin American countries who were already winning independence from European countries. So the idea was stay out of what's going on over here and let us conduct our own business and get our country off the ground. So that's where we're going to leave off. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day.